You can have a life of ultimate success despite personal setbacks. Stu Crum will share from his book, Aim for the Uprights. We'll see how evil never pays off in the Bible, and Dr. Donald Unger did something for 50 years just to prove his mother wrong, and it's cracking him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up on episode 121 of Manly with Andy. Now joining the podcast, it's Stu Crum. His book is called Aim for the Uprights. More on that in just a moment. But I like to start every conversation, Stu, with the question, what do you think is the biggest challenge that men face today, and how do we overcome it?
Now, obviously, this is my response, and I'm sure you get a varied amount of responses on this. Mm-hmm. I think it's remaining a godly Christian person, both at work, at church, at family, in your home, right? I mean, being consistent. I think one of the greatest difficulties that I have found, I mentor a lot of young people now. It's a good thing about being old is you start mentoring people. And the one thing I have found that people challenged on being, a faith-based person, both, away from work and at work and whatnot. It's the consistency. It's just really the consistency they're having in their life. And I think the way we do that, so I'll give you an answer on how we do that. I think we do that just by being very intentional in how we live our lives and knowing that everything we do needs, I personally put through my Jesus filter and say, am I honoring and not honoring God in what I'm doing?
Well, I love that. Well, let's talk about a little bit about your history and what brought you to write this book. So talk a little bit about, your career as a football player and how God brought you to where you are today.
Yeah. So, just quick story. I started off as a place kicker, had a successful career in college, was drafted by the New York Jets in 1983, jumped to another league. There was a USFL league back at that time that was competing and took actually half the NFL players to this league. I was 23 and poor and engaged, and they offered me twice as much money and it felt like a great idea. I spent 3 years off and on in the USFL and NFL. I never actually kicked a football in the NFL, so to be clear. I was drafted in the NFL, played actually in the USFL, was cut by the New York Jets when I went back to the NFL in 1985 and had to get a real job. And I had a lot of opportunities. One was full-time working for Fellowship Christian Athletes, actually. What I felt my calling was, to be honest with you, was to be in the full-time ministry and business. And that's what I've done the last 40 years. Fast forward, had worked in the oil business for my first 28 years. I've gotten to private equity my last 10 years. I've been a 5-time CEO. Right now, I just took over a new assignment about 6 weeks ago, running a company that's private equity backed and building companies, building their cultures, and then selling them eventually. And so, long story short is that's kind of what I've been doing the last 40 years.
All right, so talk a little bit about the inspiration behind this book, about your book, Aim for the Uprights.
Yeah, so let me tell a quick story about Aim for the Uprights, and then I'll tell you the inspiration around the book. So 1983, 2 weeks before the NFL draft, special teams coach of the New York Giants, they never drafted me, but came out to my field. I was at the University of Tulsa at the time, put 10 footballs on the 30-yard line, which would have been a 40-yard field goal, 10 yards with the end zone. He said, Stu, I want you to kick the football. I said, Coach, this is going to be great. I kicked a 58-yard field goal that year. It's going to be easy. He says, but I want you to do something different. And I want you to kick the ball for the goalpost. I want you to actually kick the ball and hit the upright. And anybody knows an upright goes 3 inches in diameter. It goes about, 20 feet in the air. Kicking a football from 40 yards in the upright is just about impossible. But by golly, I wanted to play in the NFL. So I swung my foot, kicked my first ball, and I actually hit the upright. And I'm not sure who was more surprised. He had never seen anybody do it. I knew I didn't think I could do it. So we were both elated, excited. I ran high fives to everybody on the field. But I kicked my next 9 balls. I missed. I was close, but I missed. But at the end of that, he said to me, Stu, why do you think I asked you to do that? I said, Coach, I have no idea. He says, well, I know you can kick a football through the field goal for the goalpost. I've seen you do that a lot of times. He says, but we teach people when they go from college to the NFL to find something really small in the middle of that goalpost and aim for that. Because what you guys in college are doing, you're aiming for this goalpost. And if you miss a little bit to the right or left, you miss your field goal. We teach in the NFL, aim for something small. He says, you've been aiming for good. I want you to aim for great. And that became literally on that day of my life at 23 years old for the last 41 years became a metaphor for my life. Is Stu, don't just aim for good in what you do, aim for great. Okay. So that's the name of the book. But as I started, and by the way, 2 years ago at this time, I had no intention of writing a book. zero tension. But what happened is I sold a business that I was the CEO of to a company called Circle K. Most people know the Circle K brand. It was a car wash business that we sold to Circle K. And one of the gentlemen I negotiated with said to me, "Hey, Stu, man, I've talked to you for 6 months now in this negotiation. You got a really interesting life. You should write something about it." So I said, "Well, I didn't think my life's that interesting, but I will think about this," and sat down, put pen to paper. On a weekly basis, I write a note. For the last 10 years, I've been a CEO, I guess 11 years now. I write a note to my team. It's usually an inspirational note. And so I had 130 pages already written of things that I'd written. And then as I started writing the book, what I noticed was I thought it was going to be a leadership book. But it morphed from a leadership book to really an intentional playbook in my faith journey, 40 years of marriage, raising 2 kids and now 4 grandchildren. And it just really kind of became a book that said, you know what, a lot of us struggle with a lot of things. And here are things that I've learned. I'm no smarter than anybody else, but the great thing about being 64 and having some gray hair is you learn a lot and you become wiser. And I've put that wisdom that I've learned over 40 years into a book that I think can help people as they're trying to maneuver their life through family and through their faith and whatever vocation they have. This works for any vocation. You don't have to be a CEO, but whatever vocation is, I think I've got a lot of pretty good learnings for folks that I've learned sometimes the hard way.
Well, Stu, I've heard this too, because I'm one of those people that I think, boy, I don't think I could ever be a manager or a CEO. I don't think you'd want me in that position. But I've also heard this, that everyone is the CEO of their own life.
That's right.
So talk a little bit more about that. Maybe even people like me that just say, well, this isn't for me. I don't have to deal with, I don't manage people. Talk about some of the things in the book that, it's universal.
Yeah. So, and by the way, it's not written for people that manage. Right. The largest team I ever managed, 23,000 teammates. It's a lot of people, right? Mm-hmm. But this book is really written to people about managing their lives. So the intentional playbook, faith, what's intentionality? I have 8 major points in that. The first is, what is your purpose? And by the way, it's not just about business. See, that's the point of this book. It's what is your purpose in life? Mm. My wife and I sat down 40 years ago and kind of wrote a mission statement. And then we've been very purposeful as we've had 18 career moves. We've lived overseas. All these things weren't by accident, but what is your purpose? And then within the purpose, what are your priorities? We don't have enough time, unfortunately, to go through all 8 steps, but it's purpose, priorities. Take away distractions. How do you take away distractions? Find harmony as you're working through this in your life. You got to self-reflect, because sometimes we ebb and flow in our life, right? Sometimes life gives us lemons and we need to make lemonade out of it. And we didn't have intention of doing that. Take responsibility for your actions. One of the things that drives me crazy today, there's so many people that they say, well, it's somebody else's fault. No, actually, we got to own our actions, right? Next is you got to have grit. Grit just meaning sometimes life gets hard. We've got to keep on going, even when sometimes it doesn't feel like we can go. And the last thing is do it with a smile on your face, have fun. So everything that I've done, so as in parenting, literally, my wife and I were very purposeful as we raised our children. They're now 32 and 34. They're grown adults, right? And raising their own children. But we were very thoughtful about doing it. Was I a perfect father? Absolutely. I was not a perfect father. Did I try to be my best father? I did. And even though I made some mistakes as a father, I was very intentional about what I did. And let me just give you one example. I love golf, but I gave up golf from the time I became a father at 30. From the time I was 30 to I was 53, I stopped playing golf. Why? Because I couldn't be a great father and be a great golfer. Golfer on Saturdays takes about 6 hours. I need to be with my kids because during my week, I was pretty busy in my career. And so that was an intention that I did. Now I'm 64. I played golf for the last 11 years. The kids are grown. They're out of the house. I have time to do those things.
I love that. I think about there's things in my life, because I've got kids right now, Stu, that are 6, 12, and 17. So there are things I think I have passions that I have zero time for. And I think I have to put it on the shelf forever, but I'm glad to know I don't have to. So that's great.
And you don't have to. That's the great news is we do grow up and our children do grow up as well.
So let's talk a little bit more about your journey. When you talk about, because I think this is something that, especially nowadays, it's more, I think there's less stigma behind it. But when you have to make a career change and pivot, I guess maybe is the word they use now, when you had to kind of put your pro football dreams on the shelf and pivot to another career, what did that look like?
Well, I was smart enough, and believe me, I wasn't very smart when I was growing up, but I was smart enough to know that even when I was in college, that football wouldn't last forever. I was hoping it'd last a lot longer. I really never made a career out of football. I never made a career. I got to fulfill a dream that I had as a 13-year-old boy. So that was pretty cool. But I never made a career out of it. I was smart enough. I had a father and a mother that were great examples, three brothers, that two of which were older than me and kind of showed me the path that, I better be a student too, right? And I better be right. So I was actually a very good student in college. I actually detached my retina my senior year in college. So I came back for my fifth season. I actually worked on an MBA my fifth year, which the university paid for, which was wonderful. And I always knew that when football ended, I would do something else. And I thought it'd be in sales or marketing. As a very young man, I say young man, meaning my early 20s, I wanted to be a CEO. Now, I didn't know what a CEO was. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I needed to prepare myself for it. So as I started my career, and I started with Texaco, which is no longer a company, it was bought by Shell Oil back in 2002. But when I was working for Texaco, I always thought about my next journey in my career and what would help me be a leader of leaders someday. And so I knew I needed an HR function, a sales function, a real estate function, a marketing function, a supply function. There's all kinds of jobs. I knew that if I wanted to be a senior leader someday, it would help me doing those things. And so I kind of orchestrated that out. I thought about that. I wasn't a senior executive 35 years old, but I was learning to prepare myself when I became a senior leader. And I say that's kind of how I prepared myself is football ended at 25 years old. I took 2 weeks off and I went to work. Now, the one thing that I mentioned earlier, but I want to say again, I had 4 job offers. I was very fortunate, and I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time. I was pretty well known in the community. It's not a big community, and I was an All-American athlete for the University of Tulsa, so I was pretty well known. And I was offered 4 jobs. One of them was with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which is a ministry that I loved back then, I love today. And my wife and I really sat down and said to ourselves, is this where God wants us the rest of our life? And actually, the answer was no. It was in business because I wanted to be in the full-time ministry as a business person. So that was a decision that we made very, very early on. And it was those types. And then I went to work for Texaco, which is one of the jobs that I was offered. So once again, intentionality very early in my career and in my life to help me think through where I wanted to be.
And I think, Stu, there's a lot of people that will, just like you went through that struggle, a lot of people that might be even listening right now, a lot of guys that think, I would love to do full-time ministry, but being in the corporate world, that is full-time ministry too. I'm sure you found that to be the case.
Yeah. One of the things that, and I hope there's some listeners that can take this to heart. When I was in college, I was on fire for God. I mean, I was just on fire. I thought the only way to serve the Lord was in full-time ministry, right? Mm-hmm. And I was so wrong because all of us are in the full-time ministry. Be really clear about it. If you're a Christian serving the Lord, you're in the full-time ministry. You're a plumber, an electrician, a doctor, or a radio host. Whatever you are, you're serving God daily in those tasks and what you're doing. And you're an example for others. You're an example for your family. You're living your faith through your life every day. I want people to understand that. And one thing that I didn't realize until I got a little bit older, as I moved in my career, my wife and I started creating a little bit of wealth. Now, I never worked to become rich, but we did create some wealth. We have had the opportunity over the last 10 years in particular to bless a lot of people, a lot of ministries, to be very generous. And we believe what flows in should flow out. It's in my book, actually. It's in the last chapter of the book, because if God gives it to us, we need to give it back out, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is the one thing that I've been able to do over the last, as I said, 10 years is God's blessed us financially. And we've been able to help a lot of folks that we couldn't have done if we were doing something different.
I love that. One thing that in your book that I've heard mentioned before, and I'd love you to just dive into this topic a little bit more because I think it's so important, is the idea of being a servant leader.
Yeah. There's been a lot of books. I was a servant leader before I knew I was a servant leader. And servant leader, servant leader simply means putting yourself kind of last before your team. Your team comes first, right? That's in my definition. Now, it wasn't until I became a senior leader, really running big companies. I've run a couple multi-billion-dollar companies, that I really had to understand what servant leadership was, because being a servant leader doesn't mean that you can't be a tough leader. I've had to dismiss teammates, and that's the hardest thing that I do as a senior leader because I care about people immensely. But they may be the wrong person on the bus, and sometimes I'm actually doing them a favor. by letting them go. Servant leadership simply means that everything I do put through my Jesus filter, and I try to put the teammate first, whether that's a hard decision or not a hard decision. And I've read a lot about it. There was a lot written about servant leaderhood prior to Stu saying he was a servant leader. But in trying to live it on a daily basis, it is trying to live your life. I am second, right? There's been a great book written about that. I am second. In your marriage, great marriages, you're always putting your spouse first, right? Great leaders are always putting their teammates first. It doesn't mean that you don't make hard decisions, which I've already said twice before, but it means that you're trying to put others before your own needs.
I would love you to just dive a little more into that, because I think it's such a great point that sometimes if you have to let someone go, it might be the best thing for them. I think in our world now, it's so difficult to share the truth, and even biblically share the truth in love, that we think that sharing the truth, if it hurts somebody's feelings, that we shouldn't share it. But in your positions, you have to do that. How do you balance that with ambition and empathy, and when you're dealing with that?
Yeah, Andrew, great question. I mean, seriously, great question. First, you do it with compassion. So I have probably over my career, well, matter of fact, second chapter of my book, yes, it actually tells a story. So I went into Bridgestone Retail, which people in the United States would know Firestone stores or Tires Plus stores. So I ran that company. And this was about 11 years ago. I was hired. And when I was hired by the board, and I was a president of this very large division, the CEO, he said to me, Stu, we have the wrong leadership team in place, but I'm not going to tell you what you need to do. And so I went in for 3 months and I just listened. And I realized in 3 months that if we were to get from point A to point B, I had to change the culture and change a lot of the people in leadership. And I ended up having to terminate 8 out of 11 people that loved the company they worked for, had worked for the company from 25 to 45 years. But I knew that they were the wrong people on the bus. So how was I going to do that and do it compassionately? Because I will tell you, that was the hardest week of my entire life I've ever had. Because it wasn't just I was letting people go. I was letting go of people that really loved the company they worked for. But I knew when I was hired, I was going to have to do this because the CEO knew it needed to be done. And he had to hire somebody that was willing to do it. And so every meeting I had, sat and we talked. And as much as pain as I knew, I actually was very empathetic for the people. I was extremely empathetic. And I felt their pain. I literally felt their pain. Now, we gave them nice packages. And in most cases, for the first 3 months, they did not think Stu was a great servant leader. Stu was a great Christian guy, right? I think after the fact, some of them actually said, thank you. Some of them today still don't say thank you. And that's the truth. But I will tell you that it was the right thing for the business. The business grew. The business prospered. I had a financial responsibility to my shareholders, not at the expense of these people who cared for the company, but at the expense of the other, but for the other 23,000 people that also worked there. And we became more profitable. We grew more. The business became a better business than it was. And once again, as hard as it was, and every one of those meetings I had with every one of those people, it was hard for me, but I did show compassion, and I did it in a loving way. And I think you can do things in a loving way. And as I said, for some people, they actually said thank you a couple years later because they were in the wrong jobs, right? They just didn't know at the time, and their ego wouldn't have allowed them to leave that job. So don't think being a senior leader, or not even being a senior leader. I mean, pastors have to go through this. Principals of schools have to go through this. Everybody has to go through, because you got to have the right people on your bus if you're going to be successful. And sometimes it causes you to have to make really, really hard decisions, but that's what you've got to do. But there's a way to do it. There's a right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. And I like to think I did it the right way.
Yeah, and I just think, we all have to have hard conversations, and it's hard to and we shouldn't duck them. And often we do. I'm just thinking, Stu, as a parent, how many hard conversations do I go, I don't know how to approach it. So I just take the path of least resistance and not deal with it. So maybe let's open up that topic. How do you, What's the best way to have hard conversations with people?
Well, I think first thing, you got to have a relationship with that person. So the first thing I do when I come into the company as a leader is I don't talk about business the first couple conversations we have. We actually talk about them. I know their family. I know who they are. I know what makes them tick. I know what's important to them. I know what's not important to them. And so I get at a personal level. So whoever it is you have a hard conversation with, you've got to know them. You've got to know them because then at some point they recognize that you had to make the decision for the right reasons. At least in your mind, it was the right reasons. But if they don't have a relationship with you, they kind of discount everything you do. So the first thing I say when I have these hard decisions, I make sure I know people well. Second thing, and I think this is probably the most important thing, is it should never be a surprise when you do it. Because on the journey, I'm having conversations with people throughout. With my son. My son was a gifted athlete and played professional baseball, but he kind of was your typical jock, right? And so I had a lot of conversations with this young man from the time he was 12 to 18 because he was behaving in certain ways that he didn't want. So when Dad really put the hammer down at the very end, he wasn't surprised because Dad had been talking to him along that journey. So I'd say the second thing is don't ever have a surprising conversation because we should be having these conversations beforehand. People should know that you're not happy with their performance. They should know that you're not satisfied with the way that they're leading their team potentially. So don't have surprises. The third thing and most important thing, and I've talked about this already, is you can do it with compassion, and you can do it with compassion. When I had that hard conversation with my son or my daughter, I didn't have any hard conversations with. She was pretty much an angel most of her life. My son, I had a lot of hard conversations with, I can tell you. But I always ended with a hug. I always end with a hug. He may not want to hug me. And by the time he was 15, he was a lot bigger than I was. And he was a lot stronger than I was. But he always knew that Dad loved him. Some of the hard things that we did together. And right now, by the way, he's a neat Christian young man, really a neat Christian young man. So those hard conversations really ended up, and he knows it. He knows that Dad did the right thing. He didn't maybe know it at 15 at that time, but he knew it at 15 and a half. And he knew at 16, he may not know, but he knew it at 16 and a half. He always knew in the very end that I was doing what was best for him. And I think for the most part, not always, but for the most part, when you have those hard conversations with people know you're doing it in love. They can feel the love, the compassion that you show for them.
You've managed multiple companies. You've had an incredible career. And again, the book is called Aim for the Uprights. But I wanted to finish off with this question, Stu, because I think we kind of talked about the pivot a little bit a while ago. I think the most difficult thing to do is figure out when is it time to move on? Right. Especially if maybe things are great right now in your career and you think, why would I leave? But if you might be feeling that nudge and you have to think, okay, is this just me being bored and I shouldn't be bored and I'm just looking for something flashy and new and I don't need that? What should people look at when they think, when they're trying to decide, is it time to maybe pivot to a new career or to a new job or new position?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, you got to ask yourself why you want to do it. And that's why I think it's so important. And I did learn this early age, intentionality. Intentionality for me is setting a goal. What is ultimately you trying to achieve? And so if what you're doing right now, if you can't answer what you're trying to achieve, first you got to decide that, right? So I think that's the hardest thing is you got to ask yourself, what do I want to be when I grow up? Now I'm 64 years old. I'm still working. I just started a new CEO job 6 weeks ago. And I'm still asking myself what I want to be when I grow up, right? But in everything that I do, I'm asking what is my purpose in that? Once you've asked that question, then you've got to ask, is the job that I'm in fulfilling me to get my purpose? If the answer is yes, you should probably stay there. If the answer is, I'm not sure, you should probably spend a lot of time in prayer and be spending time with your spouse or your close friends or your mentors and people that are helping you think through that. And I think mentors are really good for young people in particular. Young people, I call young people, by the way, 25 to 45. But I think most people should have a mentor because mentors really help you think through things in your life that you may not be thinking about. And if you say, I know what my purpose is, if you say, I'm not sure if this is in my long time purpose, and then your next stage is if it's not, then what should it be? And I think you have to answer those questions. I've had in my job, I think I mentioned I had 18 moves in my job. My wife and I and my children actually moved overseas, used to live in New Zealand. I've had a lot of international assignments. Everything was purposeful. And I can't think of many things I've done that I haven't really been intentional in why I chose to do that part of my career. So it's the intentionality of your life starting with your purpose.
Now taking a look at the Bible, picking it up in Judges 9, verse 22. After Abimelech had ruled over Israel for 3 years, God sent a spirit that stirred up trouble between Abimelech and the leading citizens of Shechem, and they revolted. God was punishing Abimelech for murdering Gideon's 70 sons, and the citizens of Shechem for supporting him in this treachery of murdering his brothers. The citizens of Shechem set an ambush for Abimelech on the hilltops and robbed everyone who passed that way. But someone warned Abimelech about their plot. One day, Gal, son of Ebed, moved to Shechem with his brothers and gained the confidence of the leading citizens of Shechem. During the annual harvest festival at Shechem held in the temple of the local god, the wine flowed freely, and everyone began cursing Abimelech. "Who is Abimelech?" Gal shouted. "He's not a true son of Shechem, so why should we be his servants? He's merely a son of Gideon, and this Zebul is merely his deputy. Serve the true sons of Hamor, the founder of Shechem. Why should we serve Abimelech? If I were in charge here, I would get rid of Abimelech. I'd say to him, get some soldiers and come out and fight." But when Zebul, the leader of the city, heard what Gal was saying, he was furious. He sent messengers to Abimelech in Arumah telling him, "Gal, son of Ebed, and his brothers have come to live in Shechem, and now they're inciting the city to rebel against you. Come by night with an army and hide out in the fields. In the morning, as soon as it is daylight, attack the city. When Gal and those who are with him come out against you, you can do with them as you wish." So Abimelech and his men went by night and split into 4 groups, stationing themselves around Shechem. Gal was standing at the city gates when Abimelech and his army came out of hiding. When Gal saw them, he said to Zebul, "Look, there are people coming down from the hilltops." Zebul replied, "It's just the shadows on the hills that look like men." But again Gal said, "No, people are coming down from the hills, and another group is coming down the road past the diviner's oak." Then Zebul turned on him and asked, "Now where's that big mouth of yours? Wasn't it you that said, 'Who is Abimelech, and why should we be his servants?' The men you mocked are right outside the city. Go out and fight them." So Gal led the leading citizens of Shechem into battle against Abimelech. But Abimelech chased him, and many of Shechem's men were wounded and fell along the road as they retreated to the city gate. Abimelech returned to Arumah, then Zebul drove Gal and his brothers out of Shechem. The next day the people of Shechem went out to the fields to battle. When Abimelech heard about it, he divided his men into 3 groups and set an ambush in the fields. When Abimelech saw the people coming out of the city, he and his men jumped up from their hiding places and attacked them. Abimelech and his group stormed the city gate to keep the men of Shechem from getting back in, while Abimelech's other 2 groups cut them down in the fields. The battle went on all day before Abimelech finally captured the city. He killed the people, leveled the city, and scattered salt all over the ground. When the leading citizens who lived in the Tower of Shechem heard what had happened, they ran and hid in the temple of Baal-berith. Someone reported to Abimelech that the citizens had gathered in the temple, so he led his forces to Mount Zalmon. He took an axe and chopped some branches from the tree and put them on his shoulder. "Quick, do as I have done," he told his men. So each of them cut down some branches, following Abimelech's example. They piled the branches against the walls of the temple and set them on fire. So all the people who had lived in the Tower of Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. Then Abimelech attacked the town of Thebes and captured it. But there was a strong tower inside the town, and all the men and women, the entire population, fled to it. They barricaded themselves in and climbed up to the roof of the tower. Abimelech followed them to attack the tower. But as he prepared to set fire to the entrance, a woman on the roof dropped a millstone that landed on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. He quickly said to his young armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me. Don't let it be said that a woman killed Abimelech." So the young man ran him through with his sword, and he died. When Abimelech's men saw that he was dead, they disbanded and returned to their homes. In this way, God punished Abimelech for the evil he had done against his father by murdering his 70 brothers. God also punished the men of Shechem for all their evil. So the curse of Jotham, son of Gideon, was fulfilled. So Judges 9 ends with a sobering reminder that evil never pays off, at least not in the long run. Abimelech, who schemed, murdered, and manipulated his way into power, ruled over Israel for just 3 years. But those 3 years were filled with unrest, betrayal, and bloodshed. Eventually, the very people who once crowned him turned against him, and in the end, he met a humiliating death, taken down by a nameless woman, dropping a millstone from a tower. Here's the truth. Sin might seem to work in the short term, cutting corners, manipulating, stepping on others to get ahead. Yeah, it might get you somewhere fast, but it won't keep you there. Abimelech thought that he could build a kingdom by force, but what's built on pride, deceit, and destruction will always collapse. So today, stay rooted in integrity, even when it's hard, because the path of righteousness might be longer, but it always leads to peace, and God always sees. Now entering the Hall of Heroes, Dr. Donald Unger. Where most of us stop at annoyance, one man turned a nagging bit of parental advice into a 50-year experiment. From the age of youth until old age, Dr. Unger cracked the knuckles on his left hand at least twice a day, while never cracking the right. Why? To prove his mother wrong. She'd always warned, stop cracking your knuckles, you'll get arthritis. But Unger, a physician and a man of science, wasn't content with warnings. He wanted proof, so he gave half of his body to science, literally, and waited. 5 decades passed. No arthritis. Not in the left, not in the right. His unshakable commitment to curiosity and petty revenge earned him the 2009 Ig Nobel Prize and solidified his legacy as the man who cracked a myth one joint at a time. So because Dr. Donald Unger challenged conventional wisdom with stubborn persistence and sacrificed his own knuckles in the name of science, he is officially in the Manly with Andy Hall of Heroes. Want to become a stronger man for Jesus? Steve Spicer has a ministry and a book for you. I've got a great example from the Bible that God is always ready to take you back. And Tim Freedy's love for his pets could save hundreds of thousands of people's lives, and it's injecting him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up next week on Manly with Andy.